Welcome to today's Cambridge University Press ELT webinar, Motivation in EAP and the Use of Intrinsically Interesting Academic-like Topics and Engaging Tasks, presented by Adrian Doff. I'm Simon Wright from Cambridge University Press, and I'll be moderating today's session along with my colleagues Eve Lloyd and Sarah Stokes. This webinar is part of a series of academic webinars, and it's been running for most of this week, and the final day is tomorrow. This is the fifth session out of 8 that we're doing, and I think there's been some great talks so far. You still have time to sign up to another talk following this one and talks tomorrow as well by visiting cambridge.org/academic-english, where you can see a box advertising the conference with a link to register. During the webinar today, you'll be able to hear our speaker and to see his slides, but you won't be able to see Adrian himself. You won't need a microphone, and if you want to ask a question, please use the chat box. I'll make sure that I put any questions to Adrian in the scheduled question and answer session at the end. A recording of today's webinar will be available in about a week or so's time on the registration page. We're going to be replacing the register button with a watch again button, so that's how you can access in about a week's time this talk and the other talks in the series as well. And you'll be able to download a certificate of attendance for today's webinar with a link that will appear on the screens towards the end of the webinar. So let me introduce Adrian just quickly. So Adrian Doff has worked as a teacher and teacher trainer in Finland, Yugoslavia, Britain, Lebanon and Egypt. He is co-author of Meanings into Words and Language in Use series, author of the teacher trainer course Teach English series, and the editor of the English Skills for Fluency series, and co-author of Listening 1, 2 and 4 in that series, and one of the authors of English Unlimited and Cambridge English in Power. He currently lives in Germany and works as a freelance writer and teacher trainer. So over to you, Adrian. I think your slides are just loading up again now, so over to you anyway.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. Yeah. Okay, hello everybody. I'm Adrian. I'm talking to you from Munich in Germany, and thank you very much for attending this session. In this session, we're going to look at what topics and tasks might be appropriate in EAP teaching, especially to students who both need academic skills in English, but also need to improve their general language ability. Before we start this, I think it might be useful for me to just very briefly say something about my own background and my own relationship to EAP. For most of my English ELT life, as it were, I've been involved mainly in general ELT, both as a teacher and a materials writer. And I've only relatively recently been involved in EAP, mainly through developing supplementary academic skills material accompanying a general English course book. So in this presentation, I will be approaching the topic of EAP to some extent from a general English perspective, and I'll be looking at some of the differences between general English and EAP materials, and looking at what we might learn from general English materials, general English techniques, which we could apply to EAP materials, especially for students in this kind of crossover situation where they're interested in academic English and developing academic skills, but also in language improvement. Okay, so a good starting point for this, I think, is to look at some of the differences between general English and EAP. And in the literature of EAP, quite a lot is made of these differences. I think partly as a way of defining EAP and defining what it is in contrast to general English. I'd just like to look at 3 of these differences, which seem to me to be particularly relevant to what we're talking about in this session. And so here's the first one, is the contrast between needs and what I've called here wants. In other words, to what extent do we define the content of our teaching, of our course, in terms of the perceived needs of the learners, and to what extent is it determined by what we think students might want to do rather than what we imagine they might need, or we assume they might need to do. And I think in all teaching and learning, there is a balance between these two things. In general English teaching, I would say in general, the balance looks something like this. And I'm not talking here about, for example, exam preparation classes where clearly there are very, very clear and very pressing needs, and they're very important. But a more general English class, probably following a general English course book. And of course, needs are very important and they define what we teach. But they tend to define, I think, especially the language syllabus, and the choice of general contexts and the choice of what skills we develop. And often the needs are seen as fairly long-term outcomes or goals, often expressed in terms of the Common European Framework of Reference, can-do statements and so on, often related to language skills. An example, I think, would be, for example, in general English of deciding to use the language that you might need in restaurants or cafes, because we think this may be something that learners would eventually want to do in English. But equally important, and I think there's a kind of balance between that and what we think students will want to do in the class. And I think many of the topics and the texts we choose and the tasks we decide to do in class in general English are more related to interest and engagement and variety in the class, rather than what we think students will need to do. And a very good example of this is, well, I think many of the texts are of this kind that we choose. A particularly good example of this, I think, is in a speaking activity. A very common classroom activity is students doing a class survey, mingling and asking questions and finding out about each other and reporting back. If we think about activities like this, which are very popular and very successful among students, they're not really related to the needs that we think students will have. We don't really expect students to eventually get a job conducting opinion surveys, although of course that might be a possibility. But the justification for using an activity like this is much more to do with the fact that it's interesting, it's lively, it's got lots of interaction, it gets students talking a lot and so on. So it's very much to do with what is enjoyable or motivating for them to do. If we think about EAP, I think the picture is generally rather different. It's a much more linear picture, I think, where the needs, I think, are much more pressing, they're much clearer, and they tend to determine the skills that we choose to develop, the genres we introduce students to, the language, and also, to a large extent, the topics and the texts and the tasks. So, I mean, not at all that interest and engagements aren't important, but I think they're often subsidiary to what we think is relevant to what students will need to do. I think this is a key underlying difference between general English and EAP, and I'd like to mention two other. I'd just like to mention two other differences which in a way come out of this. One is the contrast, I think, between topic focus and skills focus. And in general English, whatever the actual aim of the lesson is, which might be skills or language development, the overt focus of the lesson is very often centered on a topic. And this is what students are aware of doing in the lesson. Whereas I think in EAP there is often a much more overt focus on the skills we're developing, like listening and note-taking or using reference books. And this is clearly stated as what the lesson is about. And another difference, I think, which again comes out of these two, or out of the first one, is the nature of motivation, or the teacher's assumptions about motivation in the class. And I think in connection with this, it's worth just looking at a quotation from de Chazal. This is from his 2014 book, English for Academic Purposes. And this is what he says about motivation. In general ELT contexts, much of the motivation is teacher-led. In EAP, the stakes and students can be very self-motivated. In EAP, students are more likely to be working towards a clearly defined goal. In other words, whereas in EAP contexts, a strong intrinsic motivation can be assumed on the part of the students, in general English, this motivation often needs to be provided by the teacher, by the choice of activity, by the choice of tasks, by using engaging texts, and so on. Not that in general English classes, of course, students are generally motivated in English, but they don't necessarily see particular tasks or topics as relevant in terms of what they need to do themselves. So these are some of the differences then, just to illustrate how this might sort of play out in practice and how it's reflected in course materials. I'd just like to show you a couple of examples of course materials, one an EAP from EAP and one from General English, both at about the same level, B2 level, and both concerned with the same general topic area, which is extreme weather events and global warming and climate disasters and so on. And the first example, this is from Cambridge Academic English, actually, at the B2 level. And I don't know how well you can read this. I mean, this is just to give you a general impression of it. I hope you can see that the skill is very prominent here, selecting and prioritizing what you read. And students are taken through a series of EAP skills. So there are notes for an essay, there's a reading list, they decide what reading texts would be suitable, then they plan what they're doing. This is number 2, if you can read this. They think about what they know about the topic already, and then they look at a text, an academic text, and which they might use as drawn as a source for writing about this topic. This then leads, beyond this page, leads into a language focus on the language of cause and effect, and supporting claims with evidence, and eventually leads to them actually drawing on this to write an essay themselves. Underlying this, I think there are certain assumptions about the student, that the student is aware of the usefulness of these skills, and they will find the topic interesting and relevant in its own right. So it doesn't need to be kind of dressed up in any way, and they will be motivated to do these tasks and see them as important. Also, if we just look, look back at these 2 pages, the page itself is quite sober. There's not much illustration, and I think this reflects the serious nature of academic study. So it has a kind of academic authenticity, if you like. By contrast, just looking at the same topic area from a general English course book, this is from one of my own books that I've been a co-author of, which is Empower, a Cambridge General English course book. And you can see that the page looks very different, and the approach is very different from this. So there's, although it's actually a skills lesson, so it leads to writing an essay about an environmental topic. But first of all, the language is presented through the sort of topic, so there's focus on the topic of climate change. Students listen to news items about extreme weather events, match them with pictures, and they have a discussion reacting to comments about extreme weather events. Then after that, it leads into the skills focused. There's a student's essay about climate change, and this leads on to a focus on writing skills and reporting opinions, agreeing and disagreeing with commonly assumed opinions. And this leads then on to students writing an essay. In other words, then, in the general English example, in order to support the writing skills development, the lesson consciously arouses interest in the topic. And here are some of the ways it does this. So these are some of the features, really, of it. The very strong use of visuals, visual support, active discussion of the topic. Quite an integrated skills approach, so although it's a reading and writing lesson, there's also listening and speaking tasks. A lot of variety of interaction, lots of group work, pair work, and in addition to the skills development, there is also a lot of opportunity for general fluency practice through discussion and personalization. These differences reflect the different needs of general English and EAP learners. And in particular, as we've said, EAP reflects the more serious nature of academic study. and the importance of being relevant to students' needs. This is fine, I think, as long as we can assume that students in an EAP class are in fact motivated and have a clear idea of their needs and have some familiarity with academic study, so they can understand the relevance of what they're doing. But this is not necessarily the case, I think. And if we look again at this quotation from de Chazal, I've just highlighted what seem to me very important bits of this, that students can be self-motivated and they're more likely to be working towards a clearly defined goal, but not necessarily the case, I would say. We've been talking about the differences between General English and EAP as if they're kind of separate categories. But of course, in reality, I think it is more like this. It's more a scale from one to the other. So at one extreme end, you might have a kind of General English conversation class with no clear aims, then General English. At the opposite end, this SEAP, specific English for academic purposes, should be at the right end of the scale. I don't know, it's sort of shifted. So at the other end then is students who are actually engaged in a course of study and drawing on their own studies for their EAP classes. And somewhere further along is general EAP, but it seems to me that many of the students in EAP classes occupy a position somewhere sort of in the middle of this scale, between general English and EAP. In other words, they're learning English mainly for study purposes, but language improvement, or they may not have precisely defined study aims. And just to give you two examples of this is just from my own experience from doing workshops for talking to teachers. But I think they're fairly representative. One example is Turkey. I see one or two are from Turkey. Yeah. This is just an example I know of, but I think it applies equally to many other countries, I would say, where students often are learning English in addition to their subject of study in a university context. And they often need to get up from, say, A2 level up to maybe B1+. They're preparing for an undergraduate program where some of the teaching will be in English, so they need English for this, but they won't need to study in an English-speaking country, so they may not need a full-on EAP course. And I think an important point here is they're not necessarily highly motivated for EAP. It may be a requirement rather than something that they're opted to do themselves. Slightly different example is from the UK. Students who come to the UK with the intention of studying, they need to improve their IELTS score, and they need EAP skills in addition to general language improvement. Often I think they are very highly motivated, so that's not an issue, but they may not have a very precise idea of their study needs, or even know exactly what it is they're going to study. In both these cases, I think, it may be appropriate to have what is often referred to as an EAP light approach. In other words, an approach which touches more lightly on academic skills and which brings in some of the features of general English that I outlined in the examples. So for the rest of this, this session today, I'd just like to look at what this EAP light might look like, and how it might actually pan out in practice. And I'd like to show you a couple of examples of material which, or how we might adopt this EAP light approach in EAP materials. I think, in fact, it is clearly possible to focus on academic skills in a way that's engaging for learners who may not be highly motivated, while at the same time developing the skills that are going to be relevant to them. And I'd like to show you a couple of examples of this. The first one then is an area of reading and writing, and we're going to look at helping learners to skills of writing an academic essay, and especially and specifically the opening part of an academic essay, where they may need to define the concepts they're dealing with, so defining abstract concepts. So in a sense, the genre we're talking about here is the sort of introduction to an academic essay, and the EAP skill, the language skill, is defining abstract concepts. And as a part of this, students might be shown an example, from an authentic example from academic writing. This is actually taken from a Finnish student, I think, who is studying in Canada. This is part of his MA thesis, and the thesis is on the topic of courage in the workplace, and so he's starting off the essay by defining the nature of courage and what we mean by courage from various sources. I'll just give you a few seconds, maybe, if you could just skim read through this, just to get a sort of general idea of what it is he's talking about. Okay, so this is then used as a way of focusing on some of the language needed to define concepts. And you can see here that it's sort of this these collocations with the nouns and noun and definition and the verb differ in various ways. And then this leads on to students giving their own definitions or defining concepts within their own field of study and eventually incorporating these into the introduction of an essay. So a fairly typical sequence of kind of, if you like, EAP skills development activity. I think various points about this, that this area in this text is certainly relevant to students' needs in writing academic essays, and you could transfer this also to other subjects of study, of course, but it isn't in itself a particularly engaging text, except maybe for the person who wrote it and the supervisor, or maybe somebody who is themselves interested in this particular area of study. But it seems to me that there are ways in which this topic can be focused on and actually made into something which is more interesting to learners who are not necessarily motivated. And I'd just like to look at some ways, I think, in which this might be done. The first one, I think, to start off by talking about the topic. So a lead in, getting students to think about the topic. What do you understand by courage or a courageous person? Is it a question of character? Is it a question of behavior? Is it both? So sort of brainstorming probably in a group. And then perhaps also part of a lead-in, maybe a discussion, drawing on concrete examples. So taking this topic away from the abstract and making it a bit more easy to identify with. So for example, what kind of courage might a nurse need? What about a student? On what occasions does a student need courage? What about a firefighter? And so on. And as you can see, with visual support to make this a bit more immediate as well. And then another possibility is to personalize it. So bring this into the sphere of students' own experience. Think of a courageous person you know, somebody you know personally perhaps, or a well-known person. What did they do that was courageous? Some further discussion. And then, I think, a prediction task. So you can get students to try defining courage. Write a definition of courage without using a dictionary. Compare with other students, then maybe look it up, see what the dictionary says about it, and then maybe go and look at the text that we just saw, the authentic text. So I think what's happening here is we're bringing in features of general English methodology that I discussed earlier into EAP, and as the EAP skills are presented through an initial focus on the topic and a series of tasks which involve active engagement, lively interaction by the students, and which provide motivation. So this motivation isn't just assumed, but I think it's generated, if you like, by the task, by the teacher, and maybe helps to make what is potentially a rather dry, abstract topic something that is actually very interesting to talk about. I mean, actually, the nature of courage is a very interesting topic. Students may not be immediately aware of this without task support. Okay, so that's an example then of one way to maybe deal with a fairly abstract academic skills area and make it more accessible. A slightly different approach, which, I mean, this is not an alternative, it complements this, is to actually choose topics in EAP which are in fact of general interest, even if they aren't related to the learner's subject of study. And I'd like to look at an example of this. This example is about, we're moving now to listening and speaking skills. And we're going to look at a fairly standard EAP area, which is listening to class seminars or lectures and identifying what the speaker is going to talk about from the speaker's introduction. And also in speaking, doing this yourself, of course. So the way the speaker signals at the beginning what he or she is going to talk about. And the topic, so this is the EAP skills focus down here, is outlining the content of a presentation using signaling language. But this is embedded, or could be embedded, in a general English topic, where there's no need for this to be done through something very abstract or highly academic. And so this is a possible general English topic, which is male and female communication. In other words, the difference between the way women often talk to each other and the way men often talk to each other. A lot has been written about this, as I'm sure you know. So this is, well, this is an academic topic, sociolinguistics, I suppose, or maybe gender studies. It relates to various academic areas, but it is also a topic which I would be very happy to deal with, say, in a general English class. I think it's a topic of general interest. So a way that this might work is that you might, again, start off with the topic focus. So think about the way men or boys talk together, the way women or girls talk together. Do you think there are any differences? And get this guided a bit, talk about topics they talk about, reasons for talking, body language, how they speak, how they listen, vocabulary and expressions. Of course, a lot of research has gone into this, so it's an academic area of study, but students also, of course, have their own personal experience of this, which they can draw on anecdotally. This would then lead into a focus on listening skills, which is the main aim of the lesson, in which students listen to an introduction to a kind of class seminar on this topic, and then make notes from it, and then identify how the speaker uses language and also stress and intonation to make it clear what he is going to talk about. I'd just like to play this to you. Just so you might notice how he uses some particular signaling language.
An interesting question about
communication
is how do men and women communicate?
And is
about
communication
and that's the topic
how do men
of
and
my
women
presentation.
communicate? And is there a difference?
First of all,
and that's the topic
I'm going to
of my
describe
presentation.
research that
Right,
people have
first of
done
all,
in this area. So
I'm going to
just give you a
describe
general idea
research that
of the
people have
features
done in
of
this
male
area.
and female
So let's give you a
styles of
general
communicating.
idea.
In fact, a lot of
Features
people
of
have
male and
already
female
written about this
styles
topic.
of communicating.
Then
In fact,
I'd
a
like
lot of
to
people have
show
already
you some
written about
examples
this topic.
of typical ways
Then
that
I'd
men
like
and
to
women communicate.
show you some
And
examples.
Lastly, we're going to
of
look at
typical ways
language
women
features,
communicate.
and we'll see
lastly,
that women
we're going
often
to look
use
at
different
language
grammar
features.
from men
And
when they
we'll
talk.
see that women
And
often use
at the end,
different
I hope we have
grammar
a short
from
time for
men
discussion.
when they talk.
I'm going to
And
start by
at the
looking
end,
at the research.
I hope we'll
Now,
have a
as I
short time
said,
for discussion. I'm going to start by looking at the research. Now, as I said, there.
So that was just the introduction. So talking, as I'm sure you picked up on the fact he used the signalling words first, later, and then, and so on, and also he uses the rhythm and stress to highlight the main content words of what he's talking about. So this would lead on to the skills focus, but introduced through a topic itself, which itself is lively and of general interest. Okay, so these are just a couple of examples of possible directions for so-called EAP-light material. Just to summarise then, before we finish, what we're talking about, sorry, okay, right, just to summarise the points we're talking about, what we're really talking about is a kind of crossover then between general English and EAP, where the skills and the language are determined by predicted needs of the learner, which can be quite precisely defined, and of course can include also study skills and also critical thinking skills. But the initial focus is on the topic itself rather than on the skills. And the topics are selected which are of general academic nature, but which also have a high level of intrinsic interest will be suitable even for general English learners, so not related to any particular area of study necessarily. And motivation is not assumed, but it's actively enhanced through visuals, layout, engaging tasks, and also a variety of varied interaction. Oops, sorry. There's a point missing there. Okay. Also, which gives opportunities for general language improvement and fluency development, as well as skills development. So, just thinking back to the comparisons I was making earlier, what we're really doing here is incorporating features which are a kind of standard, are commonplace in general English teaching into developing EAP skills. And that brings us to the end of this presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and also for your comments running through. We have time to respond directly to them, but I think we've got a little bit of time for any questions.
Adrian, thanks very much for that. Please type into the chat box now any questions that you want putting to Adrian. I only got a couple in so far, so do have a think. We'll just spend a couple of minutes answering these. First question I have here is from Asha. What is a good source of EAP Lite topics? Are there any materials that we can?
Yes, well, I don't know if I'm supposed to say this or not, but one source is the material that I've been working on with my co-author Craig Thane. Actually, we've been developing a series of worksheets of academic skills development, and have been using, these examples came from that, in fact. So choosing topics of which have a generally academic nature, so they're not quite like general English topics, but are nevertheless, I think, of general interest. Yeah. So, for example, sort of development of island tourism is one example. Things that people talk about in their everyday lives. This is worksheets accompanying Empower. So that's something you might like to look at. Beyond that, I think if you were generating your own material, I would actually look probably at the kind of topics that are used in general English course books and see what potential they have as a basis for EAP.
That's great. Yeah, I think those can be found on the Empower website. I think that you just mentioned that before. So yes, those are materials that you could use. Another question here, just looking through these. And what about letting students choose their own topics? This would make them more responsible for their own learning. What do we think about that?
Yes, I think that's a good idea. I mean, I'm not quite sure what context you're thinking of. I think that's a good idea if this is EAP with students who are perhaps already engaged in academic study. So they have a very clear idea of what topics, of what skills they need, of where they're going, what they want it for. I think in general EAP, it would be important to choose topics which lend themselves to what skill you develop as well. So I think it's not just a question of choosing an interesting topic, but it's a topic which also generates a particular kind of skills development. Yeah. So, for example, the example I've just given you, the topic of male and female communication. This then leads into something which is very focused on EAP skills, which is listening to a seminar about this. So I think there has to be this relationship.
Okay. Final question, I think here. What was the textbook used by the presenter about climate change?
By the two textbooks, you mean? The first one was the example of an EAP, typical EAP textbook, was from Cambridge Academic English. I think it was B2 level. And the second example, which was the general English textbook, was from Empower, which is by myself as a co-author, and also Craig Thane, my co-author. So that's part of the Empower series. Again, I think
okay, lovely. There's some good questions coming through, but unfortunately we have another webinar in less than half an hour, so I'm afraid we're going to have to call time on this one. So thank you again to today's webinar.